Under the blue hush of a winter night, the prairie breathed in long, aching silences. Snow fell in loose ribbons, catching the faint glimmer of a reluctant moon. The ranch sat against that vast emptiness, its fences stretching like skeletal arms, its barn door rattling in the wind as though it held a secret it could no longer bear. Caleb Whitmore, 30 years old and worn by more than his share of solitude, pressed his gloved hand to the door and felt the cold bite through the leather. He had built this place with the grit of his youth, stacked beams and nailed roofs against storms, but he had never built walls high enough to keep out loneliness. Tonight, though, something stirred beyond the timber, and for the first time in months his pulse sharpened with curiosity. What could be moving in the barn on such a night? The hinges groaned as he eased the door open. Warm air, faint with hay and horse musk, rolled against him. His lantern cut a trembling circle into the dark. At first, he thought it a trick of light, a pile of blankets carelessly tossed in the straw. Then he saw the rise and fall of shallow breaths, the dark spill of hair glistening with melted snow. She was curled in on herself like a creature hunted by the cold, her hands bare, skin flushed and raw, lashes crusted in frost. A trespasser, his mind insisted. Yet his chest tightened with something gentler, more dangerous. He stepped closer, boots hushed by hay. Wealth had made him careful, solitude had made him guarded, but this vision undid him with a swiftness that startled. She was young, maybe 22, her face marked with beauty not softened by safety but sharpened by hardship. The shawl she clutched was too thin for the storm. Beneath its folds, he glimpsed the beaded trim of clothing not of his world. A widow, he would later learn, from the remnants of a tribe scattered across these plains, bearing a name he would come to cherish, Ilara Redbird. For now she was simply a shadow that breathed. He should have shouted, demanded answers, hauled her out into the night to prove no weakness lived under his roof. That was what neighbors would expect, the men who already muttered that Caleb Whitmore was odd, proud, too private for his own good. But the storm outside howled like a judge, and his lantern showed him trembling shoulders rather than threat. Something cracked open in him then, some brittle layer that had kept his heart closed off since boyhood. He bent, voice low, so low it startled even him. "From now on you're mine." The words hung in the air, reckless and unplanned, yet they felt older than the snow, older than the grief that bound them both. Her eyes opened. They were dark, searching, wary as a wounded bird's. She did not flinch, though a tremor shook her. Her gaze locked onto his with the fierce dignity of one who has lost everything yet refuses pity. For a moment neither moved. He felt the barn tighten around them as if the beams themselves bent forward to listen. What would she do? What would he? By morning she sat in his kitchen, shoulders straight despite the weight of exhaustion. He had left bread on the table, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, but she touched neither. Instead she studied the window as though memorizing her way back to a world she had been forced from. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, struck by how her silence filled the room heavier than words. He recognized that silence. It was kin to his own. He thought of his parents, both taken by fever when he was still half-grown, of the nights he had stood alone under the stars, swearing his ranch would rise from grief's ashes. And yet here he was, a man with land and cattle, with a house warm against blizzards, and still emptier than the barn she had slept in. He tried a question, where she had come from, if she had kin, but her lips pressed tight. When she finally spoke, it was not to him but in sleep. That night, while tending the fire, he heard her whisper another man's name, soft and broken. Caleb turned away quickly, shame prickling under his skin. She belonged to grief still, not to him, perhaps never to him. What right had he to claim her with words whispered in the dark? And yet he could not ignore the pull, the sense that fate had shifted on the snowy floor of his barn. The days unfolded with quiet tension. She lingered on the edges of his labor, shadowing him across the ranch but never asking nor offering. He noticed her mending one of his torn shirts without being asked, her fingers trembling as she threaded the needle, her eyes darting away when he caught her in the act. He noticed too how the neighbors' glances sharpened when they passed by. Whitmore keeping an Indian woman in his house, it would be spoken with disdain, with suspicion, with all the venom the frontier could muster against what it refused to understand. Caleb bore it in silence, shoulders squared against the judgment, but inside, shame twisted. Not shame of her, never her, but shame that he had once cared about the opinions of men who knew nothing of loss. And then one evening she was gone. The storm had rolled back in, swallowing the ranch in a white blur. Caleb's heart lurched when he found her blanket folded neatly on the chair, her place by the fire empty. Panic, a feeling he had not known since boyhood, clenched his chest. He saddled his horse in haste, snow stinging his face as he scoured the valley. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper her name. The prairie stretched endless and merciless, and with every hour he feared he would find her too late. What had driven her away? His silence? His claim whispered in the barn? His failure to understand the depth of her wounds? At last, near the riverbank he saw her, crumpled against the drift, skin pale as moonlight, breaths shallow. He leapt from the saddle, gathering her in arms that shook not from cold but from terror. Her body was light, frighteningly so, as though sorrow had stripped her down to bones and spirit. He carried her back through the snow, each step a vow he could not yet name. By the fire he coaxed life back into her hands, rubbing them between his palms, pressing warmth into her with a desperation that surprised him. Slowly her lashes fluttered, and her gaze found his. For the first time her lips moved toward gratitude, a single word carried fragile as smoke. That whisper burned into him deeper than any kiss might have. She had never been claimed by kindness, only by loss, and in that moment he swore to himself he would rewrite her story. But could he? The days that followed softened. She accepted meals now, laughed once, a sound so rare and bright it startled them both. They spoke little, yet gestures carried more weight than words. His hand brushing snow from her shoulders, her setting his cup at the table before he reached for it, their quiet evening spent in shared silence that no longer felt empty. Still, longing lingered in her eyes when she looked out the window, a longing for belonging, for roots, for something more than survival. Caleb saw it and feared it. If he did not anchor her here, would the world steal her again? One evening he draped his late mother's shawl over Alara's shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar, its edges worn but still warm. She startled, her fingers clutching it as though holding not cloth but a memory passed into her keeping. Her eyes shone in the firelight, and though she said nothing, he felt something shift between them, fragile yet unbreakable. Could gestures speak love louder than any declaration? Yet the world pressed closer. Rumors thickened, neighbors spoke louder. One even came to his gate, voice sharp with accusation. "You'll ruin your name for her, Whitmore." Caleb stood tall, the weight of choice heavy yet clear. "I'd rather lose my name than lose her." The words fell steady, unshaken, and in that moment he knew his path. When he finally asked her to be his wife, it was not in grandeur but in quiet certainty. No crowds witnessed, no priestly sermon echoed. Snow fell heavy, softening the world as they stood beneath an ancient oak, its branches bowed like a blessing. He looked at her, not as a possession but as a partner, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own loneliness transformed into something living, something whole. She pressed her forehead to his chest and whispered the words he had yearned for since that night in the barn. "Now I am home." Years later, the ranch bore not just cattle and fences but warmth. The air filled with laughter that once had no place here. Caleb and Alara walked hand in hand through fields no longer barren, the snow of memory softened by the spring of shared life. And if you, reader, ever find yourself in the quiet ache of solitude, remember, love is not claimed with whispers in the dark but proven in storms survived side by side. Somewhere within you may lie a barn, cold, empty, waiting. And perhaps, when the snow falls hardest, someone will arrive unexpected, carrying the fire you never knew you longed for. Listen close.